Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about how to start a derivation. In the next video I'll talk about how to move a derivation forward, those intermediate steps in reasoning. And then in the last video with the slides I'll talk about how to conclude a derivation. And then in the final video for the unit I will show you how to use the derivations module in the logic program to do derivations, just how to use the computer to do these things. But we'll start with just what are they? What are derivations? So remember in the first scenario that we looked at in the airport, we have this argument: if he kisses her nicely, she will marry him. He kissed her nicely, so she will marry him. And we were able to symbolize that, to translate that into our formal language. And how did we do that? Well, we said the first is a conditional. It's P arrow Q, where he kisses her nicely is symbolized by P, and she will marry him is symbolized by Q. That means the second premise is just P, and the conclusion is Q, and we use those three dots, the triple dot symbol, the therefore symbol, to mark the conclusion. That tells us in our formal language that Q is the conclusion of the argument. And P if Q, or if P then Q, and P are our premises. So the goal of a derivation is to show that the argument is valid. And so we'll reason from the premises to the conclusion, and so our goal really is going to be to show the conclusion. So how are we going to get to the conclusion? Well, we start with show lines. Sometimes when we're reasoning, we're not sure what the conclusion is. We think, well, I know this, what else follows? But other times we think, I'm not so much trying to, I'm pretty confident that a certain conclusion follows, but I want to convince myself that it does. I want to understand why it follows. I want to explain to somebody else that it follows. So I know what my goal is, and I know what I want to show. And that's the way our derivations are structured. So every derivation starts with a show line. And in particular, if it's a derivation of the show line, we start with the conclusion. So if x is our conclusion, we would write show x. Now, in our case, our conclusion is q, and so we write show q. And we put a number there because we're going to be writing multiple lines and then referring back to them, and so we number them. And this is the first line, so it gets number 1. And we put the number on the left. So this line doesn't need a justification. When we write show q, we aren't saying that q is true yet. We're saying we're going to try to establish it. We think it follows from the premises, and that's what we're trying to show, but we haven't got there yet. That means, and so we're not saying that q is true. We think it is true given the premises truth, but we haven't established that yet. And so they don't need any justification. We don't need to say, and here's my proof that q, because you're not saying q is true. You're saying, I'm going to try to show q. So there are two things we need to understand about show lines, two rules. First is that they need no justification, and so you can actually write down any show line you want. The second, however, is that the first line of every derivation must be the conclusion of the argument you want to derive. So you say, here's the argument. I'm going to try to do a derivation of it. Okay, what's the conclusion? That's the first, and then you say show that. That's the first line of your derivation every time. So that's the very beginning. There's a show line, and then the next thing you'll do is insert premises. So our argument has two premises, P and if P then Q, and so we'll put them in one by one. So first we'll have a second line, line 2, and that'll be P, and we'll say PR. And by the way, we put this isn't mandatory, but it helps to look at the argument. We don't put the P all the way on the left. We put it under the Q, and we put the P underneath the Q because we're not trying to show P. We're using P to show Q, and so it's not something we're trying to show anymore. And then we put in our second premise, and we write if P then Q, we write P arrow Q. Excuse me. And so note that in these two cases, we put in something to the right of them. We write down PR, and PR means premise, and that's the justification for these lines. We're not trying to show, we're still trying to show Q, but on lines 2 and 3, we're not making show claims. We're not saying, I'm now trying to establish this. We're saying P is true, if P then Q is true. Well, we're not actually saying that they're true. We're saying that they're true given that the premises are true. Each line, if it's not a show line, it needs a justification. We need to know why is it that if the premises are true, that line is true. Well, in this case, it's sort of obvious. If the premises are true, then the premises are true. So it's kind of trivial that 2 and 3 are true if the premises are true, because they just are the premises. So that's fine. The justification just is that they are the premises. No problem. But we need to say that. So we do. We say line 2, P, oh, that's a premise. Line 3, if P then Q, yeah, that's a premise too. Both of those are true if the premises are true because they just are the premises. And we write PR as our justification. So we have 3 columns. We have the number column, then we have the formula or the sentence column where we write show Q and P, and if P then Q, and then we have the justification column. And there is no justification for show Q, so there the justification column is empty. So rules for using premises, pretty straightforward. On any line of a derivation, you can write any of the premises. There's a given argument that the derivation is supposed to be an argument of. You're saying, I'm going to do a derivation of that argument. So you can, on any line, if the line is a premise, or you can put in on any line any of the premises. And you have to write PR as your justification, and that goes on the right. So that's how we use premises. So strategy with premises, you can write a premise on any line. So you might wonder, well, when should I write the premises? You could be in the middle of a longer derivation, and you can think, okay, it's time for me to write a premise. And who knows what 6 and 8 are, but P was your premise, and so you could write it down if it's you're doing a derivation of a bigger argument. But we want to distinguish between the rules of the system and the strategy for doing it. If you think of a game like soccer or football or basketball or whatever, they're the rules that say, basketball, you can't carry the ball. You have to dribble the ball. Where should you dribble? That's just a strategic question. When should you take a shot? From where? That's just a strategic question. So they're the rules that say what you can and can't do, but there are lots of things you can do, and so then you have to decide which one do you want to do. That's a matter of strategy. So strategy with premises is pretty straightforward. Just put them in right away after the show line, as we did in the previous derivation. As we'll see, some of the strategic questions will get more involved, but strategy with premises is very straightforward. Just put them in right away after you've built your show line. And that's what we did in our example. Okay, in the next derivation, in the next video, I'm going to talk about adding new lines, things besides premises, to a derivation.